the entirety of Chinese history in 10 minutes. Buckle up. Our story begins around 2000 BCE with the origins of Chinese civilization along the Yellow River. The Zhou dynasty is considered the first, but evidence of its existence is disputed. What isn't disputed is the Shang dynasty that followed. From 1600 to 1046 BCE, they kept detailed records on oracle bones, which are incredibly detailed for the time period. The Shang were eventually overthrown by the Zhou dynasty, who would go on to rule for 800 years, longer than any other dynasty in Chinese history. But this golden age would soon come to an end as the Zhou's eastern and western branches were eventually conquered by a series of smaller states. By 221 BCE, only one state remained independent, the state of Qin. And so the era of the warring states comes to an end with the first emperor of a unified China, the first of three great unifiers alongside Jin and Wang. He took the title of Qin Shi Huang, meaning the first emperor of Qin. Now he went ahead and did the typical emperor stuff like building palaces and having lavish feasts, but he also implemented some new ideas. He standardized weights and measures across the empire. He started the first official census to count the population and began building a network of roads to facilitate trade. And to top it all off, he connected these roads with a series of post houses where travelers could rest and receive further assistance. But not everyone was a fan of the Qin. His legalist policies and oppressive rule bred resentment among the populace. So when he died in 210 BCE, his successor was almost immediately overthrown in a rebellion led by a man named Xiang Yu. But while Xiang Yu successfully carved out an empire for himself, he too would lose it to another rebel, this time a man named Liu Bang, who would go on to establish the Han Dynasty in 206 BCE. Now the Han would go on to usher in a golden age known as the Pax Mongolica. No, not that one yet. This Pax refers to the peace that settled upon China after decades of constant warfare. The government bureaucracy became much more powerful during the reign of Wu Emperor, as the civil service exams began to be used to staff government positions based on merit rather than connections. The Silk Road also opened up during the Han, connecting China to the West like never before. But this period of prosperity came crashing down in 184 CE with the eruption of the Yellow Turban Rebellion. The rebellion shook the very foundations of the dynasty, but the crown was able to retain control after the general Cao Cao emerged to put down the revolt. Now, while Cao Cao was successful in the military, his ambitions extended far beyond the battlefield. Through a combination of cunning and brute force, he essentially brought all of China under his control. However, he would not live to see the fruits of his labor, as after his death in 2220, the empire was split between his three successors, giving rise to the Three Kingdoms period. This lasted for about 50 years until a new power emerged from the north, the Kingdom of Wei, who eventually subjugated the other two and reunified China. This marks the beginning of what is sometimes called the Northern and Southern Dynasties, which lasted from 220 to 589 CE. During this time, Buddhism arrived in China and became incredibly popular, especially in the north. Meanwhile, in the south, Confucianism experienced a revival. The philosophical underpinnings of Chinese society were further expanded with the appearance of Taoism, a religion and way of life that emphasized living in harmony with the Tao, or the way of the universe. This is most famously attributed to the figure of Lao Tzu, although it is unclear whether he was a historical figure or simply a mythical one. Now, the Six Dynasties period came to an end with the founding of the Sui dynasty in 581, who would go on to reunify China after centuries of division. They accomplished many things, such as expanding the Grand Canal to connect the north and south of China and beginning the construction of the Great Wall. However, their overextended borders would prove to be their undoing as multiple rebellions erupted across the empire, leading to the dynasty's collapse just 37 years later. The first of these rebel groups was led by Yuan, who would go on to establish the Tang dynasty. While the Sui only lasted 37 years, the Tang would last 3 times as long, reigning from 618 to 907 CE. During this time, China experienced another golden age with increased cultural and economic activity. The capital at Chang'an became the largest city in the world, even rivaling contemporary Constantinople. For the first time, China began using paper money, and thanks to their extensive road network, China was more interconnected than ever before. After the Tang, there was the Song dynasty, who saw the invention of gunpowder, the compass, and movable type, all of which helped fuel their impressive economic growth. But as the Song grew increasingly wealthy, they grew increasingly vulnerable to outside threats, specifically from the nomadic Khitans to the north. In 936, the Song were forced to pay tribute to the Khitans, marking the end of Chinese dominance in East Asia. In order to protect themselves, the Song began enlisting the help of mercenaries from further to the northeast, the Yurchen people. However, the Song soon found themselves at war with their new partners when the Yurchens established the Jin dynasty in 1115. Once again, China was divided, this time into northern and southern halves. But unlike previous times, the division wasn't as clear-cut. For while the Jin controlled the northern territories, the Song still held many important cities, such as Hangzhou, which became the new southern capital. As the Song fought back against the Yurchens, they needed a strong leader, and they got one in the form of General Yue Fei. Under his command, the Song launched a counterattack, retaking much of the north. However, the Song court was hesitant to fully commit to the war, and so Yue Fei was eventually executed for insubordination. With their best general dead, the Song were no match for the Yurchens. By 1234, all of northern China was under the control of the Mongols. Genghis Khan had united the nomadic tribes of the Mongolian steppe and set his sights on expanding his empire into China. By 1279, all of China was under the rule of Kublai Khan, grandson of Genghis and founder of the Yuan dynasty. While the Mongols were tolerant of other religions, they were not opposed to using them as pawns in their game of imperial conquest. Kublai Khan actually converted to Buddhism, although he continued to use Confucianism as a tool to better control the Chinese population. The Yuan dynasty marked the first time in history that China was ruled over by a foreign power, but the Mongols were not the last. After Kublai's death in 1294, the Yuan dynasty began to decline, leading to widespread revolts across China. It was during this time that a peasant named Zhou Yuanzhang rose to prominence. After defeating his rivals and establishing the Ming dynasty in 1368, he went ahead and did the typical Ming thing of building palaces and having lavish feasts, but he also implemented some new ideas. He re-established the civil service exams, reorganized the military, and implemented a new agricultural tax. However, perhaps his greatest accomplishment was the completion of the Forbidden City, the sprawling palace complex that would serve as the seat of imperial power for the next 500 years. But when he died in 1398, the Ming emperors that followed were less interested in governing and more interested in pleasure. The Yongle Emperor is a prime example of this. He moved the capital to Beijing, built one of the largest warships in history, and organized a massive treasure fleet that explored the Indian Ocean. But this era of exploration came to an end with the Zheng He's death in 1433, and with that, the Ming turned inwards, enacting increasingly restrictive policies and even burning foreign books to prevent the Chinese people from being corrupted by outside ideas. However, as the Ming emperors grew weaker, a new power was rising in the east, the Manchus. Originally a nomadic tribe on the outskirts of Chinese civilization, the Manchus were gradually incorporated into the empire, eventually conquering it. The Qing dynasty began in 1644 and lasted for 268 years, making it the longest dynasty in Chinese history. Under the Qing, China reached its largest size yet, incorporating Tibet, Mongolia, and Xinjiang into the empire. However, the Qing viewed the Chinese people with suspicion and thus implemented the so-called pigtail order, which forced the Chinese to cut off the front part of their hair as a sign of submission. But this policy would do little to stop the numerous rebellions that erupted across the empire during the 18th century. Perhaps the most famous of these was the Taiping Rebellion, which nearly toppled the Qing. Or perhaps you've heard of the Boxer Rebellion, a violent anti-Qing and anti-foreign movement that shook the very foundations of the dynasty. Both of these rebellions demonstrated the internal issues within China and the growing discontent towards foreigners. And it wouldn't take long for these two issues to collide. The Qing were already weakened by a series of natural disasters and rebellions when in 1839 a Chinese smuggler named Qing Shi sparked the Opium Wars. By 1842, the Qing had been defeated by a coalition of foreign powers, opening up China to foreign trade and investment. This was only the beginning, as over the next few decades, China would be forced to sign a series of unequal treaties that limited their sovereignty. However, the Chinese were not simply going to accept this fate. A reform-minded president named Sun Yat-sen overthrew the Qing and established the Republic of China. Then, after a decade of war with the Japanese, Sun and his nationalist party returned to China to find it in ruins. But they were not alone in trying to save the country. Enter the leader of the Communist Party, Mao Zedong. Together they fought back against the Japanese until in 1945, China was finally free. But their partnership would not last long as a civil war quickly erupted between the nationalists and the communists. By 1949, the nationalists fled to Taiwan, and the People's Republic of China was founded. Under Mao, China became an authoritarian communist state. The economy was nationalized, private property was abolished, and China began rapidly industrializing. But this rapid modernization came at a cost. Mao's policies resulted in the deaths of tens of millions of Chinese. Nevertheless, the Communist Party remained in power. And after Mao's death in 1976, China began to open up to the West under the leadership of Deng Xiaoping. By the turn of the 21st century, China had become the second largest economy in the world. And here we are today, sitting on the cusp of a new era in Chinese history. China has become one of the most influential countries in the world and will continue to play an increasingly vital role in global affairs. So buckle up, because the future is going to be one wild ride.